What we have to do is really start seeing how creativity permeates all innovation. Whenever we're trying to create something that doesn't exist, and also whenever we try to communicate with the other that is not like us, that involves creativity. So all learning, all education involves creativity. Because all of us are different, so we approach information differently. And so now, when everybody's so stressed out about what's going to happen with the education system, when we have chatbots that can allow kids to quote unquote cheat, well, maybe we have to start asking, is it possibly that for too long we've been rendering ourselves robotic? And we were trying to teach people things that can be too easily automated away and roboticized away. And maybe that's not really where the greatest human strength is. And maybe we really need to reconsider education that really taps into the greater depth of human creativity.
Welcome to Object Subject Form, a series of conversations exploring the human side of creativity at the evolving intersection of art, technology, and finance. The following conversation is with Monika Bielskyte. Monika is a visionary futurist, speculative designer, founder of Protopia Futures, and partner at African Life-Centric Design. Through Protopia Futures Framework, Monika emphasizes the importance of the leadership of the most impacted in all innovation processes, with major focus on disability and neurodivergence inclusion. Her work explores the sci-fi impact on the very real future making and the feedback loop between human values and the technology we design, offering profound insights into how we can craft pathways towards equitable and inspiring futures. Monika has been at the forefront of spatial computing and immersive media technology for over a decade, while consistently advocating for empathetic and socially responsible design. Her consulting clients include BBC, DreamWorks, Google, Nike, and Microsoft. In this episode, we deep dive into Monika's experiences with neurodivergence and disability, and explore the transformative power of creativity, empathy, and immersive technologies in shaping our future. Monika, welcome. I've been looking forward to this conversation all week, and we always have a lot of in-depth conversations when we reconnect, so I'm glad we can finally get one of them recorded.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to share this virtual space. Hopefully, we would share a real space in LA or in South Africa soon.
Yeah, I wish it was in person. And since we met in 2015, I think it was, I've always been inspired by your topics and positive outlook on the future. And you seem to never be in the same place for too long. And so where are you now?
I am currently in the country of my birth, Lithuania. Mm-hmm. And I haven't lived here for over 21 years, but over the last less than a decade, I've been trying to come at least for a tiny bit every summer. And of course, since the war in Ukraine started and it's coming closer and closer to here, I mean, we literally do not know for how long our country will still exist anymore. And that depends a lot actually on American internal politics. I've been definitely trying to spend a little bit more time here, but home is Johannesburg, South Africa.
Okay.
And before that, I was, for over a decade, I was, full-time nomading and got to journey, work, research in over 100 countries around the world. But, excited to finally have found a home in South Africa. So this is where my heart is. And my body's currently in Vilnius, Lithuania.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like it's been such a dream experience. And so you're a futures researcher and designer. How would you most accurately define the work that you do?
Yeah, so I'm futurist, speculative designer, and foresight practitioner, and those roles are kind of really interconnected. Oftentimes people ask me what it is to be a futurist, and they confuse it with trend forecaster. But futurism goes beyond trend forecasting. In a way, there's these sort of 3 steps into it. So trend forecasting is following what is happening currently in the world and extrapolating what are those trends and seeing what the future is like based on the understanding of the status quo. And it's generally fairly near-term extrapolation. Strategic foresight, which is something that I also do, is taking the understanding of all these emergent trends into account and then adapting them to various industries or sometimes even geopolitical contexts. And futurism is something that is a little bit more long-term, and it takes understanding the current trends, but it also, in my position, that's not how every other futurist approaches it. It requires also deep understanding of historical patterns, not just what exists in the present moment, but what are all these patterns that brought us here. And then also thinking, well, are we satisfied with the status quo, and more of that status quo, or actually would like to change that trajectory? What is actually desirable? And then how do we move towards working towards that? And then if something is entirely undesirable, if you extrapolate what could be the dystopian scenarios, how do we work to prevent them? So this is what the work of the futurist entails. And then futurist design, a speculative designer, is really about projecting those visions forward. And that could be for media entertainment industry. I worked on quite a few science fiction projects as a world designer. So doing the story, people use the term world building. I prefer the term story world design, which I think is quite different because world building really kind of evokes that you just sort of build out all of these parameters, but that's not really how the future ever happens. You design indeed certain parameters for the future, but you also nourish and in a way garden and allow it to grow. And I think story world design for me is a more apt metaphor for that. So I've done that for the projects in the realm of science fiction. I've been doing that for my own project, Protopia Futures, which is all about proactive prototyping of hopeful, livable, and inclusive future visions. And I've also been working, especially more recently, with different scientific organizations with how they can project better into the future, not just particular scientific research, but what is the world that their research would situate in, and how, in fact, they could be doing research in such a manner that actually is not just purely pursuing scientist curiosity and researching something just because it can be researched, but actually thinking how we should prioritize certain research over other, because it could help us bring about a world that we would actually like to live in.
So you mentioned dystopian views of our future, which is often what we are surrounded by and fed, particularly with the advent of any emerging technology. And we also see a lot of AI art depicting dystopian landscapes and scenarios, for example. But your outlook is often, for the lack of a better explanation, the opposite of this. And so why do you think we primarily adopt these dystopian views in our culture?
Yeah. So I think what's important to remember is that dystopia initially, especially with a genre such as cyberpunk, was kind of a protest against these techno-utopian propositions of mostly mid-20th century. And it was actually attempting to call out the homogeneity of these visions. Most of historical utopias, be it political, geopolitical, or technological utopias have been profoundly homogenous. And in fact, most of today's techno-utopianism continues being quite homogenous. And so dystopias try to resist that and to create cautionary tales of how this stuff maybe is not just what it seems to be. And even to the present day, a lot of people from marginalized backgrounds naturally resonate with dystopian future visions. I mean, I grew up as a kid that loved, Akira and Ghost in the Shell and a lot of that other sort of cyberpunk sci-fi, especially sort of Asian intellectual properties and movies and TV series, et cetera, that has profoundly informed my aesthetics. Also because we could situate ourselves more in those visions than in these homogenous techno-utopian visions. However, over the past few decades, these dystopias are not anymore really cautionary tales. They've become desperate escapism. This constant regurgitation of doom and gloom has led to us feeling that, well, there's nothing that we can do about changing the course. And there's nothing that we can do about it, then why would we do anything? So it's profoundly disempowering. It makes us abdicate our own agency in shaping something different. And in fact, to a lot of creatives, it makes them feel that these are the only stories of the future that we can tell. But, nothing is further from the truth. I think, especially for people from marginalized backgrounds, it is much more interesting instead of to imagine a future vision where, we are still the underdogs, we are still being persecuted, we're still being marginalized, we're still being dehumanized. Instead, what if we use our talent, our energy, our resource, our imagination to imagine a future that really positions the leadership of today's most impacted, that creates actually inclusive and livable future visions. And then people say, but where's the drama? We need dystopia to have the drama, to have the tension. And it's like, but even if you create something hopeful, something inclusive, something livable, it is never done, right? It's just like peace. You never just arrive at a peace and it's done. Peace doesn't come with just a ceasefire and laying down the arms. It is something that needs to be continuously worked on. And so for me, a much more interesting proposition than regurgitation of these disempowering dystopias is to imagine a livable future, and then it gets threatened again because the powers that have existed that are today's powers that be, they always end up rearing again their ugly head. So we need to keep working towards maintaining and nourishing and growing that regenerative vision. And also, as we learn to do a more inclusive and a more livable and a more compassionate world, we keep learning about what we haven't yet considered. And that's not something that should actually discourage us and say, well, if we can't have it perfect, we should not do it at all.
Yep.
But it should make us say that everything is always imperfect and it's always a work in process, and we should not get discouraged. And most of the time, change doesn't happen over a lifetime. It takes generations. It takes centuries. It maybe takes millennia. Maybe it is never, ever done. And that's precisely why we have to work towards it. So, this is kind of my beef with this regurgitation of dystopianism. But there's another side to it even, which is that dystopia becomes a product roadmap. Then a whole bunch of tech bros as well as geopolitical bros look at that and say, oh, this gives us some great ideas how to not just make money as the world burns, but actually make money by setting the world on fire. And so I think we should try and avoid giving great ideas to terrible people and instead on focusing in channeling our imaginations to create the kind of future that we'd actually like to live in. And also be really, really wary how today even we are biased through these science fiction visions, and how so much of entertainment's dystopia has been repackaged as tech utopianism, and how it creates this bias on, us thinking that going and colonizing Alpha Centauri, or Mars at the very least, is the most futuristic thing that we can do. But thinking about ocean health, or soil health, or future of mental health care. Oh, that's something so boring. That's not futuristic. That's not really exciting. That's not really a moonshot. And for me, those are the real moonshots. The moonshots are much closer. They are the soil shots. They are the ocean shots. They are the ecosystem shots. They are the human shots, in a way. So future, for me, is much more interesting, that is a bit closer to our real challenges and real lived experiences, rather than just sort of these projected imaginations where we just magically leapfrog today's issues.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely a lot of work, never-ending work to do close to home before thinking about finding a new one. And so where would you say your Protopia framework fits within all of this? On one hand, we have dystopian thinking, and on the other hand, we have utopian ways of thought. Is Protopia somewhere in between, or something else?
Yeah. I want to address also something that you just said, which how fundamentally a lot of those visions, be it dystopias or magical sort of leapfrog utopias, they are profoundly escapist. They are profoundly actually rapturous. They are profoundly anchored, in old school Christian rapture, the world the world as we know has to come to an end. The world has to burn, and then something better is going to be born out of it. And what ends up happening in reality when you set the world on fire, and this stuff happens on the extreme right, but also this stuff historically has happened with, communist and sort of extreme left movements as well, where, maybe everything really needs to get so bad that we could start this global revolution. And even now, I was looking through, some extreme kind of sides of Twitter, or what you call X today. And some people still are entertaining that discourse when it comes to current U.S. election, for example. But then what you have to ask people is the question, well, who ends up paying the price of that burning? Who is disposable for you? Because whenever there is any kind of burning, revolution, unnatural disaster, who is left behind? It's people that are already the most marginalized. Yep. And so for me today also, I think that's what's interesting within that context, is also to reframe privilege. Not around a particular sort of gender or skin tone or ability, disability, et cetera, even it often correlates, especially when considered intersectionally. But more specifically around privilege is being able to not suffer the consequences of your actions and to entertain the inaction. If you're able to think, well, that does not concern me, or I can do this and that and whatever, I can move fast and break things, because that breaking of things is not going to break me. It's going to break somebody else that for me is just the anonymous other. And so maybe just tying it back into what Protopia is and how it stands, sometimes, actually often, in public's perception, people think that it is positioned between utopia and dystopia.
Yeah.
in a similar way, how people think that, well, if capitalism is really bad and communism was really bad, for different regions of the world, then what we need to stick to is the sort of fictional, neutral, vanilla center between two oppressive ideologies. And to that I say, maybe that's not between. Maybe it's not about regurgitation of the ideologies of the dead white guys, but maybe it's beyond. Maybe it's really finally starting to lean into the insights of those that have lived at the bleeding edge of harm, into the leadership of the most impacted, what I mentioned already in the beginning of our conversation. Maybe it's not about sort of just tokenizing these identities and dropping into these communities from that sort of very much sort of what design thinking has indoctrinated us to, but really designing with and not designing for, really thinking how it's really those that viscerally understand the harms that will be reaching them first, that have the deepest insights how to make solutions that would be less harmful.
Yeah, I love what you say with regard to creatives having a role in contributing to the future, but not just creatives, I think everyone. What are your thoughts on how we could all participate through this innovation in creating a more inclusive future?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial. But for me, it's really, really important to decouple creativity from what used to be perceived as these elite, exclusive art practices. I think art is really, really important as we know it. But what we have to do is really start seeing how creativity permeates all innovation. Whenever we're trying to create something that doesn't exist, and also whenever we try to communicate with the other that is not like us, that involves creativity. So all learning, all education involves creativity. Because all of us are different, so we approach information differently. And so now, when everybody's so stressed out about what's going to happen with the education system, when we have chatbots that can allow kids to quote unquote cheat, well, maybe we have to start asking, is it possibly that for too long we've been rendering ourselves robotic? And we were trying to teach people things that can be too easily automated away and roboticized away. And maybe that's not really where the greatest human strength is. And maybe we really need to reconsider education that really taps into the greater depth of human creativity. And so I'm so fascinated how now that we hopefully awoken to the fact that we've been roboticizing ourselves for too long, and we've been sort of structuring our education institutions around a fairly sort of limited idea, what is human learning, we'll get back to imbuing with much greater creativity so many other aspects. And so, even kind of like leaning back into what we spoke about, regurgitation of dystopias, and how people today, say that, well, all of the sort of AI art looks the same. And as somebody that has been working with concept art and worked with a lot of concept artists in my past and did a lot of concept art research for the sci-fi world design that I've done, I can tell you that concept art, and especially sci-fi concept art, has been derivative. And what we're seeing today is it's so easy through using machine learning tools to create very, very compelling, very pretty dystopian landscapes. But the moment you try to put into Midjourney or any of these tools that, again, we need to address the fact that they have unethically sourced their data. They stole a lot of the art, all of that stuff. I mean, needless to say, there's no future for this industry if the ethics do not get addressed. And we'll talk about generative AI further down the line. But, what I wanted to speak about right now is that if you want to create these dystopian landscapes, if you want to create scary exoskeleton bodysuits, zombies, aliens, robots, Marvel superhero looking like bodysuits, et cetera, all the work that was the most paid within, concept art space, that stuff is very, very easy with these tools because there was so much already derivative work within that space. However, whenever you try to type in, regenerative future city, biomimetic future city, and especially when you try to be more specific, and especially when you try to imagine those futures in the context of the global South, you try to imagine some kind of like, not just Afro future, but African futurism, as in, futurism centered in the realities of the African continent. This is something that a project that I recently joined as a partner, African Life-Centric Design, is quite engaged with. What ends up happening is that data doesn't exist. You can't create those visions, or they are delivered to you in a really sort of stereotyped, fetishized, corny, and, a lot of the times also profoundly reductive to a point of being insulting kind of manner. It's not, it's not pretty, and oftentimes it actually ends up being, quite ugly, or at the very least, like really, really corny. And so there's so much to be imagined there, right? There's so much space now, for the creatives to actually be like, hey, maybe I should not be thinking of more futures in just New York or Paris or London. Maybe there's all these futures to be imagined within all of these other cultural contexts, as led by people from those cultural contexts, as led by the inclusion of actual sort of innovative, regenerative architectural solutions, design solutions, understanding of the ecosystems, et cetera. So I think there's so much space to be creative. And when we spoke about sort of geopolitics, to propose a vision that resists the politics of fear, you need so much creativity, you need so much imagination.
Yeah, I mean, on the topic of inclusion, so as you know, a big area of interest to me is and has been the immersive space, along with identity. And immersive technologies are, I think, really challenging how we think about our personal and collective identities. How we represent ourselves online, for example, through avatars and online communities, as well as in real life. And so in a sense, we're merging our in real life experiences with our digital experiences. And so how do you feel immersive spaces can help individuals explore untraditional notions of identity?
Yeah. So immersive media tech is how we met at Magnofis all the years back. And although that space was more inclusive than a lot of previous tech spaces, I mean, there were finally a few more people of color and a few more women and queer people. It was still like whenever like I meet like somebody that I could sort of resonate with more, I would be like, hey, let's, so that was my reaction to it. I was like, hey, okay, let's not just like pass each other by. Let's be friends.
Yeah, let's have a conversation.
Exactly. So I'm happy that we, all these years later, we're still continuing the conversation. And, I mean, immersive media tech is really how I got into futurism. That was my first really sort of like real introduction into the tech world professionally. I was working with a prominent Hollywood production house, and somebody found out about it and they reached out and said, well, we want to show you this like really cool demo. So you would show this big director, and for this big movie that person was working about the future of Mars. And then the moment I put one of these earliest demos on the dev kit of Oculus back in the day, and it was not a 360 thing, it was a volumetric capture, I was like, oh my God, this is what I always wanted. And that's something that, from when I was a kid, so I was this queer, neurodivergent kid of, mixed ethnic background that didn't really fit in within the very homogenous environment of a small town in North Lithuania. Whenever I'd watch any movie, and especially if I'd ever go to the movie theater, I always wanted to sit front row. And I always kind of, the way I'd see these worlds, and especially when I saw Mamoru Oshii's Ghost in the Shell, and actually, contrary to many other people, I was more of a fan of Ghost in the Shell Innocence. Because specifically of the world design, I always even when I would see the movie on the so-called flat screen, I always wanted to sit as close as possible to it. And in my head, I wanted to be immersed. I wanted to be in it. And so from the second, when I tried these super, super janky volumetric VR demo, I was like, oh my God, this is the medium. This is the medium to design these immersive future story worlds, is to prototype the kind of world that we'd like to live in. It's to be able to make people walk through that future city that we'd like to inhabit. And so I was completely hooked. Again, as janky and imperfect as it was. I mean, I also had this, very strong emphasis how we should actually, instead of trying to just overcome technological failures and be sort of discouraged by the effects of the uncanny valley, we should embrace it, and we should see how technological imperfections in a way is part of the visual expression of it, and how we can lean into it in an interesting manner, that it's not about simulation of reality. It's not about technical perfection. It's about it being compelling. It's about it being imaginative. It's not about simulations of our past or our future, but it's about making us see something that we either do not have access in the real world. So, for example, what Marshmallow Laser Feast, the collective, has done on showing you the hidden layer of the forest ecosystem, sort of the connections between the tree roots and mycelia, and the oxygen that the trees exhale and the oxygen that we inhale, and what is this hidden layer? So it's not about creating a simulacra of a tropical forest experience. It's about making you see something that is not visible with the naked eye, so that now when you go back into the real world forest, you get to see it more than what just your eye can see or your hand can touch. And it's not about escaping reality. It's about re-inviting you into reality with the new knowledge. And I have the same complaint with so much of generative AI that I had with early VR, that so much focus is being put in this attempt for a perfect simulation. But there will never be a perfect simulation. I mean, if you try to simulate reality, this expression that, then the map has to become the territory. And then the map will end up swallowing the territory that we are seeing right now with generative AI tools, drastically increasing, not just carbon emissions, but also, consumption of plastics and rare earth minerals and so on and so forth, right? And a real walk in a forest, it's not just about what you see. It's not just about the surround sound. It's not just about the wind that blows. It's not just about the texture you touch. It's about you connecting with that ecosystem. It's about you touching the the moss and the lichen and the soil, and inhaling not just fragrance, not just scent that, was at that time was, people actually were like, oh, we could definitely simulate all these scents. But the truth is that these scents, they are living entities, right? They are the fungi, the bacteria, the particles that,
organisms.
Exactly. You cannot recreate that calming experience of the forest, because part of it is, again, you actually connecting with that ecosystem. But this is not something that should make you feel like, let's just throw out Gen AI, or let's just back in the day throw out VR. It should make you think, well, instead of creating these simulations of something that already exists in the real world, which, in some cases, some training videos, et cetera, I mean, that stuff is useful. These are like practical applications. But in the
or
creative
transporting people to places that they haven't been or experienced.
Exactly. But bottom line, for me still, I mean, there's definitely space for simulations, but I was really disappointed by initially, how much money was going simply into hardware and into platforms, and that there was very little effort spent on the R&D of content and a deeper understanding all the way from human health and neuroscience on what is the impact, what is the effect of these experiences on our minds and our bodies in the long term, and how instead of, again, creating these simulations, we could maybe be creating something new that doesn't exist. And instead of tapping into these claustrophobic tricks and traumatizing people through, chasing them by zombies or somehow the space or the time or something closing down on them. Because, when something is really scary, just like with really scary politics, it's very easy to freak people out and even make them forget that this experience is not real. Like, if the trauma is real, then
experience that trauma for sure.
Exactly. And it can tap into the sort of latent trauma that is stored within your body that maybe you're not even aware of. So, I was really, really frustrated how there wasn't more consideration of all the different things that we could do, and how we could actually be doing something that would not seem like an escape from reality, but an invitation to see the reality anew, except for like really amazing few collectives. Today, retrospectively, when I think about that, I'm like, oh my God, so much of my perspective was really in relation to my neurodivergence, to my autism, ADHD, and PTSD. And the fact that I had these insights that 10 years later, you can read them and it's still as relevant for Apple Vision Pro as it was for the earliest, jankiest version of Oculus. Like, these insights, I'm shocked, because I'm like, I didn't have much experience back then. Like, I'm so professionally, I'm in so much more of an advanced stage right now than I was back in the day. And yet, it is my experience with disability and neurodivergence that allowed me to tap into something profoundly insightful. And so I was immediately thinking, about the trauma and how, because of my experience with violent physical and sexual assault, and experiences of bullying and stuff like that, I immediately thought, well, how do we not recreate this trauma? How it's not just about like shooter experiences and some kind of zombie chasing you, but it's even, menus popping up like really aggressively in your space that is not visual space anymore. When we move away from computational frame, within a screen format into computational space that feels like it enters our physical space, or that we are entering with our physical bodies in that virtual space. Yes. All of a sudden, even that pop-up menu, even the design of these letters and these colors and these shapes, they can end up affecting, certain aspects within our body and our need for the safety, not just interacting with other characters, but even with the space itself. And that's where,
because it's taking up space.
100%. And this is where, I also was getting irritated with, what is the grammar of storytelling in VR? And that's where I was like, well, it's not about world building alone, and it's not about storytelling alone. It's really about story world design, where yes, you can interact with different characters within that space, but also you interacting with the space itself. And the space becomes this, you create the possibility space, you create this potential for stories to happen. And that's what story world design really is about. And so we have to consider the textures, the colors, the shapes, the sizes, the speed at which they appear, so you don't end up not just getting nauseous and sick in that way, but also, mentally and emotionally traumatized. And, it was shocking for me how at that time, again, because even if there were more women and if there were more people of color, we still were very, very marginal voices. And people just were saying, why are you being so negative? We need to be more of a cheerleaders. And I was saying, but we want to make it good. And in order to make it good, we need to be critical, but we need to be critical not to just throw it all in the trash, but really consider what it's useful for, not just drag old media into the new medium, but really think, well, what is suitable for this medium? Even something like Gen AI and conversational interfaces. I was working with BBC and we were discussing and crafting sort of, what was sort of initially framed as a chatbot to interact with BBC Earth content. And I try to get them thinking how, well, no, this should be a conversational entity and should not be just responding to your queries and should not have the sort of fixed personality, should adapt to your learning style. I should either speak to you in a more visual manner or more sonic manner or a more database manner. And it should not just sort of respond to what you ask, but it should also make you curious. And instead of just sort of sucking in the information from the entire world and stealing other people's data, no, you're actually tapping into the extraordinary archive that BBC Earth had. So, I'm like, oh my God, this was 7 years ago I was working on this stuff. And now finally, 2 years into Gen AI, people are starting to talk about some of these things. And again, I wasn't the only one. There were a lot of other amazing people from whom I was also learning and was being mentored by. But what I realized is that it's these experiences of friction and pain and marginalization that made my insights valuable. So my experience with neurodivergence or disability didn't make me worse of a professional. It actually gave me the presence and ability for pattern recognition that people that maybe haven't experienced all these harms wouldn't have. And my propositions were never to just tear it all down. Though, there are some things that need to be torn down. But in general, I try to not engage with stuff that just needs to be torn down. I try to engage with things that we have the capacity to reimagine and make more inclusive, more supportive, and more integrative into really the kind of lives that we'd like to live in within the ecosystem that we're codependent with.
So when thinking about bridging both worlds, do you feel like there's benefit for recreation of our identity or multiple identities in digital or immersive spaces? Or would you just transfer your existing identity one-to-one into that space?
Currently, I'm actually working on the company I'm collaborating with, they called it Monika AI. And they're making these personalized AI. And we've been working on it for several months. And a lot of people that I shared, because anything I do, I try to share with a whole bunch of people to get their feedback. And the more critical, the better. Don't tell me oh my God, it's great, I loved it. Tell me what you loved the most about it, about anything, whether I did a talk or whatever I did. It's wonderful to know if there's something that really resonated with you, that you really liked. But especially tell me what you think I should be thinking more about. What are additional references that I need to bring? What is the critique? What could be, what what do you think needs to be thrown out? What do you think needs to be improved, et cetera, et cetera. And so, it's interesting because when I shared it, a lot of peers of mine were like, yeah, but it doesn't really sound like you. It comes with these sort of fairly sort of like the information is actually quite accurate because it's built on my data, right?
And you've been training it, correct? With your own information.
Currently they still don't have an interface that I could train it personally. So essentially I kept interfacing with them, sending them all of the articles and talks and interviews. But I want it to be something that I can do on an everyday basis, because I'm seeing the questions that people are asking. Sort of Monika AI, which is not the title I even like. And we are sort of really reconsidering what should be the title. But the point of it is that, people were saying, well, it doesn't really sound like you. There was one group of commentary. Can you make it sound more like you? Then the other group of people were like, oh my God, why would you do that? It's going to replace you. So then people will not need to hire you as a futurist consultant. As a future designer, they will just go to this bot and talk with it. And for me, all of this feedback and critique got me thinking more about something that I was thinking about already. And also got me thinking at other angles. And what I kind of came up with as the best solution is I don't actually want it to imitate my way of speaking. I don't want it to sound like me. I don't want it to have a replica of my voice. At least at this stage, I prefer it to be text-based format. I'm curious to develop a visual representation, but in visual representation, I'm much more inspired by the kind of work that Andrew Thomas Huang has done for Bjork, which was this avatar that is inspired by her, by the way, the kind of costume she wears on stage, It has a resemblance to her face, but it's clearly sort of an ethereal digital entity that kind of transforms itself into this creature. This avatar creature. And for me, that's much more interesting than try to capture a photorealistic version of me. Because
completely replicate.
Because
don't you think that that's when people really notice the differences? When you're trying to be so close.
Exactly. Well, that's the uncanny valley. That's the uncanny valley effect. It just seems, it just seems artificial, but in a way that is profoundly discomforting. It doesn't put you at ease. It actually, it creates this sort of imitation that you feel that you cannot trust. So, from the fact that if there's a visual representation, which I really would love to create, so whoever's listening to this podcast, please reach out to me. Let's collaborate. I want to create much more of an imaginative digital avatar that transforms based on, what it says and how it says. And maybe there's a way to sonically articulate some aspects, but it is not imitation of my own sort of spoken voice. But even in the text output, for me, it's so much more interesting to think of this entity that is an intermediary between me, my research, my past work, my current work, and whoever is engaging with that work. It's almost like an archivist. So it needs to be accurate. That's why I have to feed in my own information. But I want it to sound much more as an entity that taps into my research, and I want it to be continuously collaborative. I never want it to be finished. So whenever I see people interacting with it, and even in this beta version, I see people asking questions. I can't see who is asking these questions from where, but I can see the questions being asked, and I can keep feeding it additional information. I can also understand, what are people interested to know that engage with my work? I can also realize, maybe if it's coming up with this response, maybe I haven't been clear enough. Maybe I need to think about this particular subject matter more. Just like when I give talks and somebody completely misunderstands it. So instead of saying you are stupid because you misunderstood me, I actually have to ask myself, have I been clear enough in my message? Or I must reiterate my message. So, I really kind of land on this idea that for me, instead of trying to replicate either real spaces or our real humanity, it's interesting for me to learn from the experience of reality what is most soothing, what is most comforting, what is most inspiring, what is most magical about the most amazing cultural moments that I experienced in my life, the most amazing physical sort of moments of, me sort of, spinning in the air, suspended as a pretzel when I'm in sort of in the flow of my aerial acrobatics. What is the most beautiful about sensual moments? What is the most beautiful about my engagement with the living world? But instead of trying to reproduce that, which is not reproducible, to think, well, how does the digital realm allow me to augment it and make something that can only exist within that digital world? And it's interesting because even in practical applications, I was just listening this podcast, and I'm so sorry I will not be able to refer to exactly who the founder of the company was, but it was a woman that has founded sort of AI-supported psychotherapy chatbot that was actually utilizing not the current sort of generative AI models, but the previous AI framework, because of the need for greater accuracy and to avoid all of a sudden the chatbot saying something that it just decided to say, because that could actually, in this circumstance, could be quite dangerous. It could lead to a sort of AI psychotherapist advice that maybe, could support that person ending their life or something like that. And that founder was specifically insisting how important it is to make that interface to be clearly AI and not to try and speak in the sort of, sensual voice, try to imitate a human therapist, try to replace human therapists, but specifically see, well, how human therapist and AI interaction that is accessible at all hours of the night, because a lot of people, they need urgent help, between 3 and 5 a.m. That's the time when people are most sort of desperate and when they cannot go to their therapist. And specifically really tap into the strengths of artificial intelligence rather than try to simulate a human, and really see how these two experiences of human psychotherapy and AI psychotherapy can be supportive of each other. And so very much, this is kind of how I think, instead of creating these imitations, how we can, on one side, augment what humans can do, and on the other side, really ask ourselves this fundamental question: how maybe there's a whole set of things that we haven't been doing because in the absence of these tools, we've been trying to automatize and roboticize ourselves. And now when we can have this technological support, can we lean into these profoundly human strengths? And in many cases also, we absolutely need to not just collaborate with machine entities and algorithms and robots, and the companies that benefit from these technologies, but also really question some of these decisions so that we remain in this quest of solving problems and alleviating, human hardship and suffering and inequity, rather than trying to solve away our very humanity.
Yes. One thing I've been wondering is how you manage to stay so positive in all of this. Especially with automation. I've been having a lot of conversations with friends who own businesses and discussing their moral conflict with AI solutions versus maintaining their human workforce. And there's a lot of fear regarding the future of work and what that means for the individual, while all of these exponential technologies are rapidly evolving.
Again, within sci-fi, for a long time, we've been stuck within the sort of brutalist, low polygon vision of the future, where all these futuristic cities, they were all about this sort of like steel, glass, concrete, sort of your Blade Runner 2049 type of vibe. And part of it was regurgitation of the same visual tropes. Part of it was lack of imagination, but also a huge part of it that there was a lack of sci-fi, not just in the sort of blockbuster sci-fi movie space, but even within concept art space, is that with the tools that we had, it would take a lot of time to introduce elements of the living world, intricate vegetation, intricate sort of organic details, the animation of that in the sort of quote unquote digital analog manner without generative AI tools, was so much more laborious and so much more expensive. And what really, really excited me when the first Gen AI tools came about, even when the stuff was like super, super janky, right? Remember the first visuals that were like really, really kind of crooked and kind of like hybrid and like, not the sort of earliest DALL-E where like everything looked like dogs or birds, but, that was like so trippy. You're like, oh my God, like, machine learning sees the world like me when I'm tripping. That's where we meet. But there were this crazy forms of architectural structures that were kind of like enmeshed with like weird, but really intricate sort of organic pattern. And I'm like, oh my God, that's like a breath of fresh air. And that's something that I really, really wanted to see more of. And we did a collaboration with Indian concept artists on sort of Indian futurism idea that took elements of super, super intricate historical Indian architecture, but also introduced like really kind of intricate and specific sort of Indian vegetation to create this sort of futures of living architectures. And it was such beautiful work that before would have been really, really hard to realize. And so I think today, you can either choose and say, well, we'll just keep doing work of the same quality that we have done. And then we can fire a whole bunch of people because we can automate a lot of our processes away with that sort of fairly mediocre Gen AI stuff. Or we can actually use those human hours to go much deeper into the aspects that AI is really not great at. Like, even if in many cases AI can create sort of simulacra of human, facial expressions, but there's a real lack of depth in there. And whenever you try to prompt it to have a group of people together, or even two people, but especially a group of people together, not just like randomly standing there, but interacting with each other in very particular ways, right? Like, like this person is holding that person's hand, but it looks like they're really holding the hand in a very firm manner. And this other person, is standing a bit distant and it looks like maybe they're shy or maybe they're upset, and these sort of really intricate aspects that are profoundly human and emotional that require the backstory. Exactly. And so something like that will still be really, really hard to prompt and automate away for a long time. However, that early sort of previous process, visualization process, like that early kind of idea brainstorming, these tools can be really, really interesting at. But they become more interesting when instead of just prompting with words, you can also prompt with visuals, and then you can add additional, you can modify those visuals with your own concept art. And it really becomes like a tool that we use. It's kind of like, exactly. So, again, you can just say, well, now we got these new tools that allow us to automate away a whole bunch of our workforce. So let's just keep producing the same mediocre work. now made even more mediocre through Gen AI tools. Or you can say, well, what is this tech really good at? What is that the humans that we have on team are really uniquely good at? And now how we can complement our human insights and these assistive tools in order to create something that before would have cost inhuman amount of working hours.
I agree. It's important to look at it as a tool we integrate rather than a direct replacement, especially when we consider building out these vast immersive landscapes to explore and build. And I suppose not only to recreate environments in such detail down to even the blades of grass, but to utilize human creativity and capacity to further innovate on, I suppose, much a higher level. So it sort of reminds me of this metaphorical story I heard about when automatic petrol pumps at the gas station were introduced, and the attendants who used to pump the petrol were no longer needed. And a positive side effect, of course, there were many negatives that I'm sure are discussed, but a positive side effect was this resulted in those people who would have ended up pumping gas either staying in education longer as the opportunity dried up, or potentially they end up running the gas station opposed to being outside. So there can be very positive effects of automation.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, but this only happens, if instead of sticking with a sort of mediocre quality with now we got these new tools and we'll just still do the bare minimum. We actually consider, not just create this sort of really rich environment, with all these intricate blades of grass, but also them being rendered alive, so they're not just static blades of grass, they just like in real world, right? Like they grow and they change color and they move due to wind. So you really need to, instead of just saying like, well, I just put a prompt and it delivers me this sort of very stereotyped image that, perpetuates the same sort of, colonial ideas of human beauty, architecture, even nature. I mean, I always say how can the future and how literally anything that we do, how can we give people everything they hope for? How can we cater for their emotional needs, but not what they expect? How there can always be that elements of surprise. So, all the way back in the day, right? Yeah. When I was doing story world design in the sci-fi realm, if I think of an insect, there's some kind of aspect of the world and there are futuristic insects, I don't want to think of like some kind of like cockroachy type of beetles or whatever. Like I want to think of like almost flower-like looking with the feathery claws, pink into sort of like light, sort of lime green, like praying mantis. That's the kind of insect I want to imagine, when people say like, oh, well, flowers, and your sort of immediate imagination and immediate, machine learning imagination as like, oh yeah, okay, well, sunflowers, roses, tulips, or like whatever most sort of cliched kind of idea. If you prompt in like, oh, South African flower, maybe it's going to come up with something cooler like the Protopia. But when I think of like, oh, futuristic flower, I think of these like crazy sort of bird-like looking like orchids, from the Amazon forest. And I want to imagine flowers like that, right? So being able to use these tools, being able to tap into the rich data of this world, yet being able to prompt it much more accurately to input and design and draw in something that is much more rich. And then there's more than enough work for everybody. And especially, again, what we spoke early in this conversation, for people from the backgrounds that have unique either cultural or lived experience, disability, religious, social, et cetera, backgrounds. All of a sudden, all these voices that have been overlooked, they become the most valuable, and they can have the greatest input, right? And the same aspect that used to be like so much of a sci-fi imagery when there was no Gen AI and people had to draw it all out, used to be like, well, there's this dystopian cityscape and there's a singular hero standing wearing this sort of futuristic cyberpunk clothing, looking very forlorn and alone, and that stuff is easy to automate away. But as I said, the moment you try to put in two characters and you say, I want these people to be kissing, and it produces you the most corny version of two people kissing. And, and if you have kissed and if you had like a really fabulous experience of kissing somebody that you love, just how many different ways you can be kissing and holding hands. And if you've been in a group of people, like in some complicated family dramatic meeting, how all of these people are so different, and these expressions on their faces and the sort of their, the way their brows are furrowed are so different based on their lived experience. And all of that stuff is something that humans are so great at. And so I think this is something that we should be tapping into instead of just being like, well, AI can help us produce the same boring image that we've done so many times of our singular hero standing on a dystopian cityscape looking on a cyberpunk high-rise landscape with some neon signs. Like, no, let's now embrace this opportunity to ask ourselves for more. And so all of these considerations need to be taken into account before, metaphorically and sort of very realistically things are being put in the wild and people are being overpromised something that is not yet there. This idea that, in 3 years' time, we're going to have artificial general intelligence. I mean, it's that, in many cases, it's not like we go back to the sort of God or demon discourse. And people think that, well, okay, maybe the God discourse, that's dangerous, that's overpromising. But even the demon discourse, even saying that it's going to be so powerful, it would have the capacity to destroy the entire world, that's pretty hype. That's using some kind of fear mongering to make people feel that, but it's really already so good, you should be investing money in
before
it
it's too
while
late.
you can, before we destroy the world. Before the world burns, like just cash it now while you can. So, even that demon discourse, even that doomerism, it's not sort of the positive hype, but it's critic hype, but it still ends up serving this purpose where we end up, propping up these fears that are seeped into sci-fi narratives and fiction and overlooking the very real issues. But again, that's why I disagree with a lot of people that jump on completely different end and just say, well, let's just set it all on fire. We still need to be realistic. And so this idea that we'll just succeed in burning it all down, it won't happen. But it doesn't mean that we should just be embracing it just because it is positioned to us as inevitable, that now we just must accept it as such. And I think, as we move forward with certain technological paradigms, it is really, really hard to push the genie back in a bottle. But we also have to say, but this genie shouldn't just be designed or deployed in this particular manner. So I think this is fundamentally different, right? When you engage in really constructive criticism, and also when you are truly inclusive when it comes to disability. I think disability is a really, really good filter when it comes to, are we actually making the kind of innovation that ends up supporting people? And I see these very sort of similar, on the surface, like naive approaches, but they end up dangerously, for example, in this case, embracing eco-fascist tendencies. When people say, well, cars suck, so we should have these carless cities, everybody should be walking, everybody should be cycling. And, we're not disability exclusive because people that have wheelchairs, especially power wheelchairs, they'll also be safer and be able to use it. And then what you realize is disability is not this easy binary. Disability goes beyond just wheelchair access, blindness, and deafness. It also includes people with chronic conditions, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, autoimmune conditions, inflammatory conditions, compromised immunity, cancer patients. It also includes elderly people. It also includes pregnant women that, in many cases are not disabled, but have overlapping needs
Correct.
with people that are experiencing disability. And in some cases, pregnancy can be disabling. Old age can be disabling. And so you end up preaching for the kind of stuff by abolishing technological structures as they are, that end up excluding entire swaths of society. Like, public transport is amazing, and I think we should be embracing public transport. And it's absolutely true that we need to consider how we should be installing HEPA filters and air circulation and all of that kind of stuff that would make it easier even for people that are immunocompromised to be able to use public transportation. But you know what? Some people are too immunocompromised. Some people are too fatigued that particular day to be able to walk or cycle or take public transportation. And so we need to be inclusive of that. Similar stuff with machine vision. It can be really terrible for the purposes of surveillance of the population, especially within the context of fascist governments. But for a lot of people that have blindness or are hard of seeing, that
Extremely
can be
positive.
something that can really, really support their capability to move through the city and to be able to engage what they need to engage with, and their lives being much safer. So, so much of technology is also assistive technology, and a lot of that gets erased out of the history. Right? So, from subtitling to being able to darken or lighten your screen or to increase the size to voice assistants to even email.
Just accessibility in general.
Exactly. And so what I say is that we need to lean into that more. And, even if it's impossible to tomorrow abolish all military tech and abolish all of the technology that is being developed for the police state apparatus, what we must do is to lean into technological innovation that originates not in those type of industries, but that originates in disability adaptation, in neurodivergence adaptation, and in our creative needs, and our spiritual needs, and our true sort of human connectivity needs, not just with each other, but also, as I said, with all of the other species. So I think as we lean more into that, and as we, decide that there's ways to engage with it that is not just about burning down, but really reconsidering how it's being designed, whose data it uses, how that data should not be stolen, all the ways that it gets to be deployed. And in all of the steps of this process, we are designing with and not for, and we're not trying to recolonize the space and recolonize bodies and minds, but regenerate the space and the bodies and minds. I think then we're going to start approaching something that hopefully can make this world a little bit more livable.
Yep, hopefully. And I completely agree. And earlier you touched upon the topic of neurodivergence and disability. And as somebody who has directly been affected, particularly by neurodivergence and misdiagnosis of neurodivergence, for example, depression, how has this affected your life path?
Massively, massively. Gosh, the roots of the story go so deep. But maybe I'll start with I think that it's pretty much a fact that ableism paradoxically is, if not the least addressed ism, it's definitely one of the least addressed isms. And what is so truly unbelievable about that is that it is an ism that is not about a fixed identity. It's a moving identity that none of us is prevented from inhabiting unless we die a sudden death. So we come into this world needing others, and at multiple times of our lives, or at least once more in our lives, unless we die a sudden death, we will experience disability or neurodivergence or a whole combination of those. And yet it's something that is so profoundly stigmatized, and it results in a massive, 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 massive harm. It feels like every time when somebody gets diagnosed with cancer, it's like they're the first person to whom this is happening. And when they have to confront their mortality, when they have to confront the disability, there's such a profound sense of shame and hopelessness, and that feeling that somehow, life is done, life is over, or life needs to be postponed until this particular issue is dealt with. Life, that somehow your life is less worthy, or you are less lovable. And, I think, cancer is just such a, and people will even call it the C word and don't utter the C word and things like that. But the reason why I'm using it is that 50% of us about half of us will go through cancer journey in our lifetimes. I mean, that is crazy. And pretty much, if you live, past your 30s, it is pretty much an absolute certainty. So it's like the chance is pretty much 1 out of 1 that you will be dealing with a cancer journey of your loved one, be it your partner or your best friend or your sibling or your parent or your child.
I mean, yeah, in my life, I've definitely experienced that, like probably three times.
Right?
Yeah. Not personally, but people, loved ones in my life.
Exactly. And once that happens, and especially when it hits really, really close to home, when it happens to either yourself or your immediate loved one, you are in too much of a vulnerable position to change the world at that time. And of course, there still are amazing, amazing people who, while they're going through this journey, end up changing the world so that, even if maybe they can't change it in time for their own journey, they feel like their legacy is to facilitate other people's journeys. So that they don't have to confront the same type of adversity or insensitivity or medical malpractice or psychological bullying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, it just shows you how this is not some kind of like marginal issue. This is not some kind of charity work. Disabled people, the moment you start including all of the conditions, from, breaking your leg and then being like, I mean, that's also what, for example, something that happened to me. I experienced the world's airports and train stations and all of these infrastructures, in a wheelchair after I had a fracture, and I still had to work and travel because I have to pay my bills. And all of a sudden I had a whole different experience of what it is to be in an airport, of what it is to have to do the most basic tasks, and how inaccessible it is for somebody in a wheelchair or with crutches. Yeah, things that you take absolutely for granted. And also the sense of, shame that people still to the present day have. I mean, I had to walk through this conversation with several friends of mine who didn't have a fractured leg, but who were dealing with other issues that made it too risky for them to, for example, make a very short connection somewhere without knowing whether, how long the lines are going to be, in the baggage check, or immigration or whatever. And that sense of shame, like, but how can I demand disability service? And then people are going to see me in a wheelchair and then they're going to think less of me. And I'm like, wow, like really? And I realized also how lucky I was, like for whatever reason, be it about my neurodivergence or queerness or disability, I never really had that sense of shame. When I needed a wheelchair, I requested a wheelchair and I made sure I had that wheelchair access because I was like, I can't miss that flight connection and I'm not capable of making through without that service and without that support. And I had and I saw how people would look at me and be like, oh, she's so young and she's in a wheelchair. Like, I wonder what is the deal with her or something like that. And yet there's this constant sense of shame or feeling that you're less worthy of love or even less worthy of life. And that is just absolutely not true. Because fundamentally, even when in Protopia Futurist Design Framework, I speak about embodiment and this rich sensory experience of the world. But again, it's not about you having perfect eyesight so you can see this beautiful landscape. And if you can't see this beautiful landscape visually, then somehow your experience of travel is not going to be complete. Because I know friends of mine that are hard of seeing or blind and they love traveling and they love to experience new places and they notice so much more than a lot of seeing people. And same thing, friends of mine that are going through cancer journeys, that are immunocompromised, that have different issues with fatigue that doesn't allow them to do the same, physically challenging or physically sort of extreme type of things. And you say, but is that person able to experience being in the mountains in the same spectacular manner when they were like climbing these mountains? And the answer is absolutely fucking yes. Because it's not just about going from peak to peak. It's actually noticing what is also the view from the valley. Right? And it's.
Would you say it forces you to become more present or hyper aware?
In many cases, yes.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of things that we do take for granted, we end up noticing a lot more. It's almost like this heightened sense of focus.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, from the moment when our happiness, after we have, shelter and enough food and safety,
Yeah.
And physically also when we're not, there's a whole different thing, right? When you're in extreme pain. And most people that are in extreme pain, they do want the pain to be alleviated. But there are a lot of people, who are deaf who either do not, for example, even if we're given that chance, they do not necessarily want to have their hearing to be returned to them through technological means, or who sometimes wear hearing apparatus and really, really enjoy tuning out and switching off or taking off apparatus and being able to experience this joy of silence and see, deaf language as a really, really rich language expression that is as rich as us speaking vocally in English or French or isiZulu or whatever other rich sort of sonic written etc. language. So it's not fundamentally in life. It's not about quantity. It's about presence. And it is hard to be fully present when you're in extreme pain. However, a person who is blind is not ignorant. And that's why we need to retire some of these words, like blind spot or, oh, you're blind to that. That connotes ignorance, or things such as tone deaf. Like a person who is deaf doesn't have to be insensitive and unaware of other people's emotions or context and stuff like that. So we need to really sort of examine the ableism within our language, and we need to examine the ableism within our assumptions when people are confronted with different health challenges, how somehow that makes their life more miserable or less worthy, or they deserve less love because the future is less certain. Because, for a fact, sure, when you're dealing with, a dangerous health condition, you are rendered much more aware of your mortality. But all of us are living every day of our lives without any guarantee that we will still wake up here tomorrow. And the more all of us would understand that, how there maybe is not another chance to express to somebody that we care and that we love them and that we're curious about their experience of the world, about their memories, about their views, about their stories. The less we postpone that and the more present we are with each other and the more we see how every day, every moment matters, not because we can be with each other forever, but because we are here with each other right now. The better we would be acting, the more compassion we'd be acting towards all of us. So I think this kind of speaks to physical disabilities and how society perpetuates ableism that cuts people's lives short because of the hopelessness that, especially for people that encounter disability much later in life and when it comes really unexpectedly, that it can create, and the sort of the lack of self-worth that it can generate because of, again, how every single day this ableism and ableist beauty standards and ableist social standards and ableist romantic standards keep being emphasized. But a huge other aspect that I've dealt with my entire life is the second part of your question, which is neurodivergence. And what you mentioned is misdiagnosis. And this did happen to me, and this happens to so many people of marginalized backgrounds, and especially to women of color.
Why?
Because most of the diagnostic criteria has historically been set up around upper middle class, predominantly white boys. And because of that, there is this ignorance, how it does not always present in the same way within people of marginalized genders and marginalized backgrounds because of the physical punishment that sometimes we suffered either within our families or within our school environments or within our communities, and how we were forced to mask and conform. But it's not like it made our needs or symptoms disappear. And in fact, as we grow into teenagers and adults, and we've learned to mask it so well, it's not like we don't have these needs or don't feel them. It just keeps taking increasingly higher toll on us to be forced to conform into the world
because we're not owning it.
Well, I mean, again, it's not about owning. It's the fact that still there's so much preconception around that. I mean, I've been told so many times, by well-meaning people like, oh, but you don't look autistic. Oh, but you have friends. You seem very social, so you can't be autistic. Or, but you're so successful, Monika. You've achieved so much. And I'm like, well, actually, so much of what I achieved today, I actually attribute to the insights specifically that are due to my experience of neurodivergence. This kind of phenomenal pattern recognition that is so necessary for a futurist and foresight practitioner. This is so much due to my neurodivergence. Yet, what ends up happening is society doesn't want to cater to the needs of people of marginalized backgrounds. So it's much easier to dismiss these needs as imagined or attribute them to something else that would not require those accommodations. And that's how a lot of people again, from marginalized genders and marginalized backgrounds, immigrant communities in the global South, end up misdiagnosed, and specifically in the case of autism and ADHD, get misdiagnosed with depression, anxiety, and sometimes even things such as bipolar disorder or psychosis or something like that. And why that's extremely dangerous is because you end up getting not just not having your needs met or being able to advocate for yourself and express that, but also you end up getting medicated with something that is really, really wrong for your condition.
Yeah.
Right? So, of course, SSRIs and benzodiazepines and other things that work for people that have depression, that can work for somebody with ADHD and autism in specific cases. But if, in my case, it got misdiagnosed with anxiety and depression, and I was given benzodiazepines in my super, super, super young teens. Whereas what I needed is ADHD medication, and what I needed is to not be forced to wear school uniform that was really, really I have sensory hypersensitivity, right? So I'm super sensitive to physical textures, when I speak about physical textures, everything from clothing that I wear, if there's any tags or seams or something is squeezing me, it can start itching me. It just becomes so uncomfortable that I keep not being able to think about anything else. But also sense, a certain artificial sense can give me nausea. Also sounds. So at school, like super loud sounds of the bell between classes. It was so disruptive every time. It's also bright lights, especially later in the day. So there's so many
crowded spaces,
people feeling entitled to your body. And, when I found myself, so at age 16, I somehow managed to, I don't know how I did it, but I managed to convince the school principal that I'm not going to be going to school anymore and I'm going to just graduate studying by myself at home. And my academic performance excelled, and I was like, it was not ideal. I wish I would have understood what was happening. I wish I would have been able to be with people, who would have made me feel like it's not like everything's wrong about me, but that I have a community and I have people that also have similar needs. But all that I needed was quiet. All what I needed was this isolation. All what I needed is not to be in this constant noise, in this constant, environmental friction that really just doesn't work for my neurotype. And it can work sometimes. Like I really enjoy when I give talks and I'm at conferences. I really enjoy being on stage and I really, really enjoy speaking to people afterwards. And that's when people sort of misperceive it and say like, oh, but you are so social. You communicate really well. You can't possibly be autistic. But if you throw me in some kind of environment where, environment is already hostile because of other, biases or bigoted perspectives, et cetera, and I don't know anybody, and I don't know what are the cultural sort of standards of interaction, because I also exist between all of these different cultures. It becomes really hard, and most of the time, I'm just going to leave.
Would you say it's because it's not a controlled environment? When you're on stage or giving a talk, there's preparation or some sort of familiarity, or it's an experience that you've participated in before. You're in a sense the architect of the space in that given time.
I think that's more about different sort of modality of human interaction, because I've traveled so much, and I travel to some really dangerous places, be it dangerous because of sort of certain environmental, natural circumstances,
Sure.
dangerous sort of terrain physically, or, that's a conflict zone or something like that. So, I love being in a super chaotic market in Bangkok, and everything is unpredictable there. And I love all these scents and everything. And yet you bring me into a huge American mall and like I am borderline or like for real having like a panic attack, and I'll feel like utterly exhausted for the next few days after. So it's a bit more intricate than that. I mean, I feel like it's a whole separate episode that maybe we should do sometime. But I think in the case of what we spoke about, conference environment versus random sort of situation in a bar somewhere, it's mostly because I really struggle with the casual talk. Like I don't know how to converse, let alone make myself interested in converse about something that, that is very sort of socially coded to
small talk.
Exactly. Right? Like, so every time when I'm in some kind of social gathering like that, like, I'll end up meeting somebody with whom we start talking about something that we're like, oh, we have these shared interests. And then the next thing we're like somewhere in some corner, like having a deep end conversation for like, if not the rest of the night, then at least half of a night, after which like, oh my God, like we just spent like 2 hours like going on a deep end. Maybe we should at least try and make an attempt to be social. And I'm going to stand up and try to be social for about 15 minutes. And I'm be like, okay, I think I gotta go home. What do but lack of understanding all that, and then people stigmatizing you like, oh, you always like try to have this deep conversation, instead of saying, well, we are of different neurotypes, and I can bring value to one type of engagement and one type of cultural circumstance, and you can bring value to other type of circumstance. And instead of sort of judging and being like, no, my way is the only way, we can understand that there are many ways to be, many ways to communicate. So, that openness and inclusivity, and understanding how, instead of judging others, what if we actually get curious of others? And specifically with neurodivergence, just how much embracing who we truly are can help us feel well within our minds, within our bodies, can make us learn so much about different ways of being, and not just human ways of being. I mean, something that I learned recently in an interview with Ed Yong, who's one of my favorite science writers. He wrote I Contain Multitudes and Immense World. The first one was about microbiome, and the second one is about sensory worlds of animals, the animal Umwelt. And in one of his interviews, he mentioned how most of the people that he was interacting with that were researchers in the animal sensory experience, most of them were neurodivergent. And them being neurodivergent, understanding that their sensory experience of the world is different to the sensory experience of neurotypical people. And it's not better or worse. There's not a value that needs to be added to it. It's something that helped them approach the research of animal sensory understanding of their world, with that openness and with that inquiry of how that difference is actually something really interesting and exciting to explore, and how it takes to really think beyond just your own way of seeing and hearing and feeling and touching. Neurodivergent people are all different. Every autistic person, every person with ADHD has a different experience. I'm quite irritated with sounds, but if there's like a tiny background sound somewhere, if it's sudden and it disrupts, then I think that my ADHD kind of comes in a mix, and it can sort of really disrupt my flow of thought. But if it's some kind of monotonous background sound, I won't mind it too much. However, if it's a scent, especially an artificial scent that I don't like all of a sudden I'm like, I don't know,
get me out of here.
Exactly. I mean, I carry, for all my flights and everything, I carry peppermint oil, I carry lemon oil, and I carry tiger balm to just be able to mask scents that drive me crazy. Cause and a mask that can help me to isolate away from these scents when I'm in a cramped, airplane with people that do not floss their teeth or do not wash their armpits or whatever else or just smoked or put a bunch of fragrance on top of them, etc., etc. So we are all different, right? And for somebody they don't mind holding eye contact. And for somebody, they do not mind as much of a touch. For me personally, I love touch, I love hugs, I love snuggles, but only with people that I have that relationship with. But all of a sudden, but all of a sudden, if a stranger just feels entitled to my body, then between my neurodivergence and experience of past assaults, it can be it can be quite re-traumatizing. And I just don't like when people feel entitled to my body. And, and then some people, especially if they have heard about me being neurodivergent or autistic, will be like, oh, so you that kind of autistic. And I'm like, what?
They start to bucket you.
So you don't like touch at all. And I'm like, no, I just don't like you touching me and feeling entitled that you can touch my body. And again, we go back to this, entitlement, right? Male entitlement, colonizer entitlement, white person entitlement to touch person of color's body or hair or whatever. Straight person entitlement to question somebody who is trans and to comment in really inappropriate manners, etc. And ableist entitlement. And this is the kind of entitlement that people still really struggle to address. And so many people that are, even people that are activists, even people that subscribe to so many other positive causes, especially with the pandemic, didn't realize how they ended up posting really profoundly eugenic, ableist, discriminatory stuff towards people with disabilities, towards neurodivergent people. And in that case, my politics has been that if I love my community of people that are immunocompromised, if I love my community of people that are neurodivergent, if I love my community of people undergoing cancer care, I can't just brush it off. And I find it so bizarre how, if somebody says something profoundly racist, and there's spaces where racism is absolutely not just tolerated, but celebrated. But we're not talking about those kind of spaces right now. We're talking about, spaces within community like ours, right? People that think that they are subscribing for equity and justice and inclusion, etc. But when somebody says something blatantly racist, and especially when that leans into sort of racist conspiracy theories, there wouldn't be so much of an issue to call it out. But when people say something profoundly discriminatory towards people with disabilities and neurodivergent people, somehow that just ends up being tolerated. Somehow that just ends up being identified. Well, we agree to disagree. Well, this is just difference of opinion. And I find it just really mind-boggling because, how can you say that then you care about your loved one that is going through his treatment? How can you say that you care about your autistic friend if you will just tolerate these utterly nutty anti-autistic conspiracies? Yet at the same time, what I also say is it is more important to call people in than immediately just pounce of them and call them out. Because the truth is that bigotry is the water that we swim in. To not have been born and raised in bigoted worldview, that's an extraordinary privilege. Our culture is permeated by racism, xenophobia, misogyny, transphobia, ableism. It is the water that we swim in, and it will take us sharing with each other and communicating. And then we can, if somebody just chooses to entrench themselves further, even when being explained, and they, it's not any more ignorance due to lack of exposure, but it's a chosen ignorance. It's an ignorance that people continue embracing, even knowing that this is actually killing people, literally. then that's a different conversation. But my invitation is always, as much as it really, really hurts how people will say really hurtful, really painful, really, just, utterly, insensitive things, directed at disabled people, and neurodivergent people. At the end of the day, we still have to try and find a way to call in rather than just call out, to explain, to share information, and to not judge somebody because they were wrong, and to not just celebrate somebody because they're right, but to celebrate the process of learning, to celebrate the conversation, to also acknowledge that sometimes it will take time, because if I'm honest, I feel like between also all of the internalized isms, there's almost nothing as destructive as internalized ableism. Like, it literally very, very directly ends up killing people. People's deaths are precipitated because of their internalized ableism and their hatred, actually, towards anything that is related to a particular disability and stuff like that. And when people tell me, sometimes like, well, I don't want to put myself in this category. I don't want to, I'm successful. I succeeded. I've done these things. I managed that. And I say, well, what if you are not this brilliant scientist? What if you're not this brilliant technologist? What if, aren't we meant to use our privilege to advocate so that it doesn't have to be as difficult for the ones that come after us? And in fact,
right, and use your position.
Yeah. And in fact, I go back to that same thing when people say, oh, yeah, but no, I don't think of you that way because you're very successful. You're very articulate. Oh, you know how to socially communicate or something like that. And I'm like, isn't it just kind of similar how to tell somebody like, oh, I think you're cool. Like, even if you're a woman, you're okay. Oh, you're of this marginalized racial background, but you're very articulate. Oh, you speak really good English.
You speak so well.
I'm surprised that oh, really? You're a scientist. I wouldn't have expected of you or something of that, and it's just mind boggling how when it comes to people with disabilities and neurodivergent people, this is still such a normal thing to say. And how oftentimes, unfortunately, people that insist the most that something like that should not be reclaimed or should not be embraced are people often that have dealt with that themselves. And I've encountered that even within my own immediate family. And I understand where that fear is coming from, and how it's socially indoctrinated. But at some point, we have to move past that. And when we move past that and we embrace the full scope of ourselves and get curious of each other, the world will become a more compassionate space. And we will start being more present. And maybe we'll start having a hope that we have a chance to belong, rather than just feel that we'll only be accepted if we conform and fit in. And this is really where my hope for the future is celebrate the learning, and get curious rather than judgmental.
Yeah, it's almost like when you stand in your own truth, you then open up access to help or discover communities that can provide some beneficial long-term support. Well, Monika, I really appreciate your vulnerability with your personal journey. And one of my goals with this podcast is to go below the surface of the creative journey, which does require a lot of openness from my guests. And we really did do that today through this discussion. And I have a question that I always ask my guests in one form or another. And that is, how, in your opinion, with the platform that you have, what does it mean to be a creative leader and voice in this space?
It's so interesting, right? Because I have, my background was a creative director.
Yeah.
And then I pretty much became a full-time nerd. But people still would see me at like some hardcore tech conference and I have a speaker badge. And just because of, how I look, my tattoos and hair and jewelry I wear and the clothes, they'll be like, "Oh, you must be a fashion designer." "Oh, you must be a tattoo artist." "Oh, you must be like,
Right.
like an artist or a musician." And I'm like, is this a fashion event? Isn't this like a hardcore tech conference? Like, I'm a speaker badge. Why would you think I'm a fashion designer?
Right. They're just basing you off your appearance.
Yeah, but you look so cool. But that combination of style and still quite a youthful look makes people think that, oh, I'm an artist, I'm a creative in whatever field that they project onto me that day. And somehow through that, there's this assumption of, yeah, you're cool, but there's also an assumption that just because of how I look, somehow my understanding of technology, science, geopolitics, and especially the interaction between all of them and that feedback loop, which is really the focal kind of core of my research, that this is incompatible. And it is absolutely compatible, and for me, creativity these days, and funny enough, I mean, I design most of my tattoos. I still have an amazing tailor in Johannesburg, and I design most of my clothes. And sometimes I work with jewelry designers to commission pieces of jewelry. And, in my talks, I have these like really pretty visuals that I still either collaborate with artists to create or create myself. So it's very, very visual. I'm a very visually expressive person. Yet, like, I spend like most likely maybe like less than 5% of my time on visual sort of aesthetic stuff, even if that was my initial background, right? It's just something, it's like a native tongue. For me, the aesthetics and visual stuff is my native tongue. I'm good at it. I don't need to work on it. I don't need to keep up with whatever is the latest trend. I mean, I kind of have my own visual style language. I don't follow what's fashionable. I don't follow what's hot really in that field. It's my own sort of visual creative expression. But it doesn't undermine my credibility within those quote unquote serious areas. In fact, this background in creativity is something that permeates it. That's why I think I have this openness of mind. That's why I've put not just my mind, but even my body into all of these different cultural, social, et cetera, circumstances, so that my knowledge doesn't remain in simply theoretical level. And I think this is what is needed. There's a whole new generation that is rising of not just creatives, but also technologists, innovators, policymakers, not just fashion designers, but also industrial designers, infrastructure designers. And it's about time to retire this idea that it's about being boring and wearing a tie and a suit. And if you are cool or look cool or have a great taste of music, that somehow that makes you less serious about that stuff. And for me,
or that you're less qualified.
For me, it's really, can we see all the ways that we can inject creativity and marry creativity with something that is really, really high stakes, right? How can the most talented storytellers and story world designers and musicians and illustrators and actors, instead of being kind of stuck in retelling the same sort of stories of fictional futures that are disconnected from our reality, how can we team up with the bleeding edge scientific researchers, technologists, policymakers, and together utilizing our talents, make this message of a hopeful, inclusive, livable, regenerative future more compelling? How can we make futures literacy? How can we make scientific literacy? How can we make geopolitical literacy more accessible and not something that seems boring and stuffy and unexciting? And I feel like only when we're going to make the subject matter as exciting as whatever is the Nike's latest drop, that's when we're going to catch the kids' imagination. And also, not only we need to catch kids' imagination, we need to catch the imagination of also the oldest people. Because right now, I mean, I keep repeating this, like, quite a bit of a depressing fact, but I don't know if it's still the latest data, but a few years ago, Conservative Party, Tory Party in UK was receiving more money from dead people than from living. So it's not just that the old people are fucking up the future for the young. It's the dead people that, and we're seeing that right now in the US, for example, right? People that are close to the end of their lives, or people that are not even here anymore, influencing the kind of policies that will ban women's right to choice, that will ban environmental solutions, that will make future more unlivable for all of us. So yes, it's about engaging the youth, and yes, it's about engaging people that will be living most of their lives in this future that we're talking about. But it's also not allowing for people to just slip away into bigotry, into isolation, into outdated worldviews. And that stuff and that communication across different groups, again, be generational, gender, cultural, etc., it's not going to happen with much more anger and much more preachy, higher than thou, purity politics type of attitude. It will happen with a compelling narrative, visual, creative invitation. And this is where not only creatives, but creativity comes in. And that creativity has to permeate everything that we do, because we're not moving towards more of the same kind of boring future. We're moving towards future that is increasingly radical. And right now it seems like it's for worse. So let's find a way to make it for the better. And let's find a way to find radical hope and work towards radical inclusivity. But that will only reach other minds and hearts if we make it imaginative and compelling and inviting, rather than punishing and judgmental. Because for as long as, we're alive, we're living, we have to try and embrace life.
Yep, absolutely. And Monika, I want to thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge today. And as I mentioned, I've been following your work for a really long time, and you've brought some new topics today that you've been exploring recently. So I feel very lucky to have been able to touch upon the work you've been exploring for many years, as well as new and important topics such as neurodivergence. And so thank you for your time and all of the honesty you've brought to the conversation today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was all mine. I mean, look, it was a lifelong journey to start embracing those aspects, and it was something that I arrived at through conversations with other people that made me love what I at first didn't think could be lovable. And made me find the strength in unexpected places. And so if I can give even a tiny drop of that back to the world, then my job is done. I really hope that others will take it and move it forward. And we'll continue figuring it out together, and hopefully IRL as well. So
Exactly.
let's make sure that it doesn't just stay virtual. I hope we get to cross paths in life again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Object, Subject, Form. Your engagement helps build a community of like-minded creatives as we navigate the complexities of our respective creative journeys together. If these stories and topics inspire you throughout the series, I encourage you to subscribe, share, and follow me through the links provided in the episode description.